All of my content is also posted on 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all of your Magic the Gathering needs, including articles, podcasts, and custom Magic the Gathering tokens and playmats. As a subscriber to my channel, you can use the discount code NEETSAHONE5 for a 5% discount in their store. You can find the link in the description below. Hello everyone and happy Friday. I'm NEETSAHONE, and each and every Friday I bring you guys another MTG related top 10. Last week we looked at the best Planeswalkers of all time, the ones that have dominated and are still dominating high-level Magic play. The vast majority of Planeswalkers, about 70 of 84 of them, have seen at least some Premier Tournament play, and that percentage will probably actually increase because there's some Planeswalkers in Standard right now who seem quite strong but haven't really found a deck yet but have plenty of time to do it. Cards like Arlen Cord, for example. The ones on this list, though, are just terrible and wastes of their mythic rare slots. Those at the very top of the list aren't even good in Limited, and a Planeswalker being bad in Limited is pretty hard to do. Many of them on this list aren't even worth being played in Commander decks. None of them on this list ever saw any major tournament competitive play, and I don't think any of them ever will. With each card, I will analyze and discuss why it is that it ultimately failed to see any real play and why the card was a failure overall. Now, let's get started with this parade of terrible cards. The number 10 Planeswalker on our list is Chandra the Firebrand. Unlike most of the others on this list, she at least made a little noise at somewhat high-level tournaments, though nothing higher than States, and like all of the cards on this list, she has no Grand Prix or Pro Tour top 8s. That said, she is definitely the least bad of the Planeswalkers on this list, which is why she comes in at number 10. She isn't terrible, certainly. She has an easy casting cost, something that isn't true of a lot of Planeswalkers of double-costed casting costs. But she just doesn't do enough. She doesn't really do a great job of protecting herself, something that is key for Planeswalkers to be great, as we saw last week. She can only kill creatures with 1 toughness, and yes, she can go to the dome, but that's not very exciting. Her -2 is pretty exciting. Copying X spells, or, any spell really, can be very fun. And because of her powerful -2, I think a lot of decks would feel fine about playing her in EDH, a format with big, splashy spells. Her ultimate, though, is somewhat overwhelming. Yes, it can kill up to 6 creatures, but it doesn't necessarily win you the game by any stretch, though it can put you in a good position. Honestly, I wouldn't even be super pumped about playing this Shondra in Limited. Most Planeswalkers are first pickable, and I'm not really sure she is. She's pretty good if you're ahead, but not so good in most other situations. She can't pull you back from a losing position like most Planeswalkers. So that's Chandra the Firebrand, the least bad Planeswalker on the list. Just imagine how bad the rest must be. However, unfortunately for Chandra, this is not the only time she appears on this list, and she is the only Planeswalker to appear more than once. So, poor Chandra. On to number 9, where we have Sarkhan Vol. This one is my candidate for when I was doing the research. I was looking at Planeswalkers, and this is the one that surprised me the most, that never saw any play basically anywhere, because honestly, I don't think he's that bad. In fact, a Sarkhan who did manage to see play, Sarkhan the Mad, is probably the worst Sarkhan. But back to Sarkhan Vol, he does suffer from a few things. One of them is the fact that he can't really protect himself, a pretty good indicator that a Planeswalker is going to struggle, but his abilities are quite powerful. 4 mana isn't the worst rate for just his +1, something that can be quite powerful in a deck that wants to go wide, and using it twice is amazing, and his -2 isn't terrible for 4 mana either. Either one of his abilities can put you in a winning position from being a little bit behind. His ultimate is also pretty powerful, and he can get there in just 2 upticks. Sarkhan, unlike Chandra, is actually really great in Limited, even though he's 2 colors, but because he never even really saw play at States-level tournaments, I do have to put him at number 9, because at least Chandra saw a little play. A word on Sarkhan the Mad first, though. How exactly did this guy see play? He came out at a time when I was taking a break from Magic and I wasn't watching things closely, and I get it. People like card advantage, but man, is he bad. He can't increase his loyalty at all, and he does start at 7, which is a lot. And if you have a deck that is well constructed, you can draw several cards with him off of his 0-costed ability, which draws you a card and then does damage to Sarkhan equal to the converted mana cost of the card. But it may as well be a minus ability because of that, unless you hit a land, of course, and then it doesn't do anything. And yes, like I said, if your deck's well constructed, sort of, like Dark Confidant decks can be, he can be pretty good. But 5 mana is a lot for that effect. His -2 does let him protect himself, but it also means he will probably be drawing you fewer cards, so you have to take that for what it's worth. It's also pretty cool he can ultimate right away, so if you have a dragon deck, but oh, guess what? His draw card ability is terrible with dragons, who on average have a high converted mana cost. So Sarkhan himself doesn't even have synergy just within the card himself. He's asking you to build a dragon deck, but his 0 ability is pretty bad with dragon decks. You'll be lucky if you draw 2 cards off of it with a dragon deck. So, I don't like Sarkhan the Mad at all, and I actually think Sarkhan Vol is a little better in a vacuum. But for one reason or another, Sarkhan Vol never saw play, and Sarkhan the Mad did. At number 8, we have Rawls Eric. He certainly isn't terrible, but he's pretty underwhelming. Shrug-worthy, even. It is nice that he can kill a creature right away. 3 damage, kills a lot of stuff, and he can even go to the dome. But his +1 and -7 are both pretty underwhelming. Yes, he can sort of use the +1 to protect himself, provided you have a creature you want to attack with that you want to untap, so in that way he can protect himself. And yes, he can help you ramp or tap down your opponent's creatures, but none of that feels like I'm really getting there. Even his ultimate is underwhelming, albeit pretty cool. Chances are you get to take at least a couple of extra turns, but the idea of working on getting this guy to his ultimate and not getting anything for it is really disheartening. However, if you ever wanted to build a Krark's Thumb deck, this is the Planeswalker for you. Also, he isn't the worst Planeswalker for cubes, where he can untap silly mana rocks like Mana Vault, or where he can team up with Time Vault for infinite extra turns. And that's why I don't have him, any higher on this list, because he does have a place where he can be pretty fun to play, and that's basically in cubes. At number 7, we have Liliana of the Dark Realms. This is a case of a Planeswalker who I think would be so much better with just one minor tweak. Her abilities are actually pretty useful, and she also only costs 4 mana. She can draw you a card, in a sense, even though that card is a land every turn. She can actually help you fix 2 if you have shock lands and the like. And her -3 is nice because of its flexibility. She can protect herself by killing a creature, or help you win a game by pumping a creature. Her emblem can be nice too, but it isn't the kind of emblem that stands on its own. It is one that sort of needs to be built around it, and emblems that don't just win the game can be pretty underwhelming. So where did they go wrong here exactly? I mean, I don't think the ultimate is where they really went wrong on making her unplayable. I think the most obvious thing is that she can't come into play and use her ability immediately to kill a creature without also killing herself. So her ability to sort of protect herself only works if you tick her up once. Most of the great Planeswalkers we looked at last week can bounce, kill, or weaken something and still survive to use their other abilities on the next turn. The other problem is that she really only pays you off for going mono-black. Something that we don't see much of anymore, with the exception of Theros, but even then she didn't see any play. This Liliana is solid and limited, but certainly not incredible, and that is usually a marker of a weak Planeswalker if you don't think you would want to be first picking it. The reason she's not great at limited is because usually you're 2 colors in limited too, and you might have like 2 swamps in play. She can still be pretty good, but she's not going to be incredible. She is, however, pretty great in EDH, where she can grab your dual lands and make stupid amounts of mana for big splashy spells and turns where you draw tons of cards, both of which are common things in EDH, and that's why I don't have her any higher on this list, because again, she does have a place. At number 6, we have another Chandra. This time the original Chandra, who was one of the original 5 Planeswalkers printed in Lorwyn, Chandra Nalaar. Unlike Chandra the Firebrand, Chandra Nalaar is actually pretty powerful and limited, but she was too clunky and too narrow to be any good anywhere else. She comes into play with 6 loyalty, which is nice, and her -X ability is actually quite strong, allowing her to kill most things and stay alive, something we've mentioned is a key to a strong Planeswalker. And her ultimate is the kind of ultimate that can just win you the game. Kill all of your opponent's creatures and do 10 to them. So her real problem comes down to her +1. Good +1s net you some real advantage, maybe drawing you a card, or making a creature token that can block, or something like that. Bad +1s do negligible things. That's what Chandra's +1 is. It doesn't protect her, it doesn't really help you win the game, except in very narrow situations where your opponent happens to be at 3 life. And because of that, she ends up being a pretty underwhelming Planeswalker, especially for 5 mana. And I hate to say it again, but we're still not done seeing Chandra on this list. But for now, let's move on to number 5. Okay, the top 5 we are looking at are the especially bad Planeswalkers, the ones where it is harder to find really anything good to say about them, and Nissa Ravane is one of those. Nissa is clearly built for an elf tribal deck, and those tend to be pretty strong, so what makes Nissa bad? Where do I begin? For her +1, you have to be playing a specific elf, Nissa's Chosen. It is nice that the Chosen goes to your library every time it dies, meaning Nissa can keep bringing them out to protect you, but ultimately Nissa forcing you to play 4 of these guys is pretty frustrating. There are just better things you can be running in your elf deck. Her +1 can be pretty solid if you're really getting there with your elves, but it is also useless or next to useless if you don't have a bunch of elves in play. Her ultimate is actually pretty sweet and can win you a game pretty handily in your elf deck, but getting there isn't always going to be easy. Still though, why don't modern elves decks play Nissa? Basically, the elf decks that do well in modern don't have a lot of interest in playing Nissa because she forces you to play Nissa's Chosen, and she makes their curve a little higher than they like anyway. Because of her narrow tribal requirements, Nissa is actually also pretty terrible and limited. Again, not a good sign for a Planeswalker. I do have one good thing to say about Nissa, though. She's pretty good in an Elf EDH deck, but not anywhere else. So let's move on to number 4. At number 4, we have our final Chandra, Chandra Ablaze. 3 of Chandra's 8 Planeswalkers ever appeared on this list. Not the best rate for her, especially because only one of them made it to the best Planeswalkers list. She's sort of the anti-Jace, since Jace appeared 3 times on the best Planeswalker list, and she's on the worst list 3 times. But anyway, this Chandra is the worst of the bunch, obviously. For 6 mana, you get 3 abilities that are frankly really bad. Her +1 can operate as removal, but you have to give up a card and a red card to do it. So discarding a land doesn't cut it. If you could discard lands for it, she'd actually probably be pretty good. She does have a -2 that can help you draw some cards, but oh wait, your opponent gets to take advantage of that too. The -2 isn't terrible against a control deck that always has 7 cards in hand, but in most other situations, it feels pretty bad. Her ultimate is definitely a fun one, but it still asks you to do a few things. The first is to make sure you play lots of instants and sorceries, and the second is to make sure they are all red. Yes, her 3 abilities all work pretty well with one another since they make you discard cards, but still, she's terrible, and there's no way she should cost 6 for these 3 effects. Even in EDH, she isn't very good at all, unless you somehow are playing a deck with every card with madness in it ever, but I don't know why you would be. Maybe Jaya Ballard Task Mage? I don't know. On to number 3. At number 3, we have Gideon, Champion of Justice. Basically, every Gideon is good, but not this one. Why? Well, it comes down to one ability again. His +1 is pretty terrible. It doesn't actually do anything. I like that they did something interesting to have a Planeswalker protect itself in this case, instead of just letting it kill something or make a token, and that Gideon can increase his loyalty by a ton. But if you don't have some creatures in play to protect him, he is still instantly going to be dead in most situations. Yes, he gets more loyalty the more creatures your opponents have, but the flip side of that is if he's gaining tons of loyalty, well, your opponent has tons of creatures, and can probably either knock his loyalty down or kill him anyway. His 0 ability brings a new spin on Gideon's ability to turn into an indestructible creature. Instead of just being a 5/5 or something, his power and toughness is equal to the number of loyalty counters he has, which means that he could potentially be huge. Still, he has no evasion at all, so he usually won't be getting in for much. Especially because if you get him to high loyalty, it probably means your opponent just has chump blockers for days. The final thing that makes Gideon bad is his ultimate. Yes, it is very powerful, and yes, he can conceivably get there with his ability to stockpile loyalty, but as I mentioned, his ability to stockpile loyalty isn't as strong as it seems, thanks to the counterintuitive nature of being good when your opponent has a ton of creatures, and generally Planeswalkers are bad when your opponent has tons of creatures. But it's not only that, his ultimate also doesn't really play well with the rest of his abilities. Say you get him to 16 or 17 loyalty, something you would have to be pretty lucky to do anyway, and you get to use the ability to nuke the board. Yes, you are the only person left with a permanent because you keep Gideon, but the problem is that his +1 now is not going to add much loyalty to him because all of your opponent's creatures are dead. So basically you're trying to win the game with a 1/1 or 2/2 or maybe 3/3 Gideon before your opponent gets something going. That sounds pretty terrible, and that's actually one of the better scenarios with Gideon, Champion of Justice. So don't play him anywhere, basically, is what I'm saying. On to number 2. At number 2, we have Jace the Living Gill-Pack. While I suspect that if I were to do an aggregate of all Planeswalker cards that represent a particular Planeswalker, that is all Jace Planeswalkers or all Chandra Planeswalkers, Jace would be number 1, thanks to the fact that his Planeswalker cards basically always seem to be good, and incidentally, that's kind of an interesting idea for a future top 10. But there is one exception to the idea that all Jace Planeswalkers are good, and that is the utter dud that is Jace the Living Gill-Pack. You know, I think they basically printed this because everyone is complaining about Jace always being good, because it's pretty clear this guy's pretty bad. He's another Planeswalker armed with a +1 that basically does nothing. In this case, he sort of helps you scry, but it isn't even quite that good, as you have to draw one of the 2 cards you revealed, which is always pretty bad when you don't want more lands, or if you need more lands, and both cards you reveal aren't what you want. His -3 is serviceable, bouncing any permanent is nice. His -8 is definitely a strong one, basically making your opponent lose his hand when you get a fistful, but still not great, because if your opponent's ahead on board, well, you're still going to lose most likely. You might be able to fight your way back with the 7 cards in your hand, but man, this Jace is bad. The only Jace never to see any tournament play, Jace the Living Guild-Pack, really shouldn't see play anywhere. Not even in EDH he's so bad. So far, we've looked at some pretty terrible cards, but believe it or not, there is one that is worse than all the rest. If you haven't already guessed it, the worst Planeswalker of all time is Tibalt the Fiend-Blooded. Quick side note, 6 of the Planeswalkers on this list are red. R&D really needs to print a new Koth of the Hammer level red Planeswalker, since on average, red Planeswalkers seem to be the worst. But anyway, Tibalt is pretty bad. I have him at number 1 on this list for a couple reasons. I do actually think he's the worst Planeswalker of all time, just in a vacuum. And because, the other reason is because after he was spoiled, there was a lot of hype about how good Tibalt could be. So if I ever get around to doing a list of overhyped cards, he'll also show up on that. But yeah, Tibalt generated a lot of excitement because he's a 2-mana Planeswalker. Everyone knew Planeswalkers were really strong cards, so playing one on turn 2 seems awesome, right? No, not really, not if it's Tibalt. He comes in with only 2 loyalty, and he has no way to protect himself at all. None of his abilities really allow you to do that. So it isn't actually that hard to kill him early. You basically have to hope you're on the play, and your opponent didn't play a 1-drop. What's more, his abilities are bad. His +1 is what generated the most excitement, the ability to draw a card and then discard a card. And people thought it would be good in Modern especially, and good in Dredge decks. Usually having a card that lets you discard a card and draw a card at the same time is a very powerful effect in Dredge. We know this as right now, Cathartic Reunion, which was printed in Kaladesh, its printing is basically broken Dredge in Modern, and people are talking about banning it. But the difference is Cathartic Reunion and other cards like it let you choose what to discard. The problem with Tibalt is you don't get to choose what you discard. Yes, Dredge decks have a lot of cards with Dredge in them, but that doesn't mean you won't discard a land or another non-Dredge card. What's more is his other abilities, well, at least his -4 is completely horrendous. I don't even know why you would ever use it unless your opponent will die instantly from it, and they usually won't be. The ability to just do damage to your opponent equal to the number of cards in hand for 4 loyalty is outrageous. That could even be, I almost feel like that could be a reasonable, like, -1, but it would be a little strong if he did that. His -6 is, of course, quite strong, but let's be real. You're not getting there with Tibalt. He can't protect himself. He starts with low loyalty. You're just not getting there. So yes, Tibalt is the worst Planeswalker of all time. Don't play him anywhere, please. Well, that does it for this week's Top 10. Going through terrible cards was kind of an interesting change for these Top 10s, and pretty fun and interesting. I can see why Wedge likes to do it so much. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button. If you think any Planeswalkers need to be on this list or shouldn't be on this list, or if you have a suggestion for a future Top 10 you'd like to see me do, post them in the comments. And if you want to make sure you catch MTG Top 10 each and every week, along with lots of other regular MTG content, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.